the most powerful emperor in ancient China was secretly in love. Not with his empress, not with his concubines, not with any woman. With a 19-year-old male government clerk. But here's what will shock you. In a culture where masculinity meant absolute power over women, where having male heirs was everything, where emperors were literally considered sons of heaven, this wasn't even unusual. Ancient China operated a system where beautiful young men could rise from copying documents to commanding armies, all by catching the emperor's eye. This created the most dangerous promotion system the ancient world had ever seen. The mathematics were simple and deadly. Win the emperor's love, live like a god, lose his protection, die like a dog. This is the story of Xian, the clerk who discovered that imperial desire could rewrite every rule of power, who rocketed from anonymous bureaucrat to supreme commander in 3 years, who accumulated wealth rivaling the imperial treasury, who had a royal tomb built beside the emperor's own burial site, an honor reserved for spouses and heirs, who nearly became the first man in Chinese history to inherit the throne through love alone. Ancient China, 2,000 years ago. Emperor Ai awakens from his afternoon nap to find his male lover's head resting on his imperial sleeve. Any other ruler would simply wake his companion and attend to urgent state business. Instead, the emperor draws his ceremonial dagger and cuts away his own priceless silk garment, leaving it as a pillow so his boyfriend can continue sleeping undisturbed. This single act of tenderness created a cultural symbol that survives today. Duanshu, literally cut sleeve, became the enduring Chinese phrase for love between men, a term still recognized across Chinese culture today. But that romantic gesture was actually political suicide. Because what happened next defies everything you think you know about ancient power. The emperor didn't just shower his male lover with gifts. He systematically positioned him to inherit absolute rule over 60 million people. The imperial court exploded. Government ministers threatened rebellion. Military commanders prepared for war. Traditional scholars declared it would bring heaven's wrath upon the empire. The ruler's response: he murdered anyone who opposed his boyfriend's rise to power. Then at 25, Emperor Ai died mysteriously. His beloved had exactly 5 days before the most brutal purge in Chinese history would erase him and his entire bloodline from existence. This is how a gay love affair nearly destroyed ancient China and created a legend that no emperor could kill. But before you think the emperor was some kind of historical anomaly, here's the truth that will shock you. He wasn't even unusual. The majority of Han Dynasty emperors maintained documented relationships with beautiful young men alongside their wives. This wasn't whispered scandal. It was an accepted part of imperial life that operated openly for over 4 centuries at the heart of Chinese civilization. What made the Han system uniquely dangerous was this. Unlike empresses who gained power through bearing heirs, male favorites rose entirely through personal charm and political cunning. They had no biological insurance policy, no family bloodlines to protect them, no children to secure their legacy. Their power rested on one terrifying foundation: keeping the emperor satisfied. The imperial court operated through a complex hierarchy where beautiful, intelligent young men could achieve heights impossible through traditional advancement, but at deadly cost. At the entry level served countless lang, court gentlemen recruited from across the empire. These young men, typically 16 to 25, were chosen not just for beauty, but for sharp minds capable of discussing poetry, military strategy, and palace intrigue. They lived in palace quarters, competing desperately for imperial attention, knowing that a single conversation with the ruler could transform their entire family's fortune or destroy it. Those who demonstrated exceptional ability could advance to Shizhong, imperial attendants with direct access to the emperor's daily routine. They served during private meals, accompanied the sovereign on travels, and joined intimate discussions that shaped imperial policy. This proximity was both opportunity and mortal danger. They witnessed imperial moods that could shift from affection to lethal rage within moments. At the apex stood the rare few who achieved genuine imperial favor, men like the young clerk who transcended mere service to become true imperial companions. These favorites received their own magnificent residences, controlled access to the emperor, and wielded influence that could elevate or destroy government ministers. They lived like princes until the day their patron died. Then they discovered the system's most brutal truth: imperial favor was not transferable. When emperors died, their male favorites faced an immediate, terrifying reality. New regimes viewed them as threats to be eliminated, not assets to be preserved. Their wealth could be confiscated overnight. Their families could be exiled or worse. Their very lives depended on the mercy of people who had every reason to destroy them. The mathematics were simple and deadly. Achieve imperial favor, live like a god. Lose imperial protection, die like a dog. In this world of silk and marble, where young men could rise from obscurity to unimaginable power, love was the most dangerous gamble of all. In the summer of 4 BCE, a moment of imperial curiosity would set in motion the most dangerous love affair in Chinese history. 19-year-old Xian was exactly the kind of person emperors overlooked. A minor secretary in the imperial archives, one of hundreds of faceless bureaucrats copying military reports in the dusty halls beneath the Forbidden City. His background was aggressively ordinary. Born in Yunyang to a respectable middle-class family, his father worked as a clerk in the Ministry of Justice, processing legal cases, maintaining court records, and ensuring imperial law functioned across the vast empire. Important enough to keep the family comfortable, insignificant enough that no one in the imperial court knew their name. The young man had followed the expected path, studied classical texts, passed examinations, accepted a position copying documents alongside scholars like Xian. He was invisible, another serious youth with neat handwriting, destined for bureaucratic anonymity. Then the emperor wandered into the archives. It was a suffocating afternoon when the 20-year-old ruler, restless and bored with court ceremonies, decided to personally review military dispatches. The archive hall fell silent as he entered, not from terror, but from the automatic deference that imperial presence commanded. At the far end of the room, the clerk remained bent over his desk, completely absorbed in copying troop movement reports. There was something about his profile that caught the sovereign's attention: the way afternoon sunlight illuminated his long black hair, the elegant concentration as he traced characters with his brush, the unconscious grace of complete focus. The emperor approached and asked about grain supply reports for the northern garrisons. A routine administrative question, the kind rulers asked clerks every day. But the response was anything but routine. The young man looked up, met the emperor's eyes without the usual stammering deference, and provided detailed, intelligent answers that revealed both competence and confidence. When the ruler inquired about his background, he mentioned his father's work with quiet pride. No groveling, no desperate attempts to impress. Most emperors would have nodded and moved on. Instead, the sovereign found himself returning the next day, and the day after that. Each visit ostensibly about administrative matters, but the conversations grew longer, more personal. Palace staff began to notice the pattern. Other archive workers watched with growing awareness that their colleague had somehow captured imperial attention. 3 weeks of these daily encounters culminated in an imperial summons written on silk parchment. Present yourself for personal imperial service. The transformation from invisible bureaucrat to palace insider happened overnight, launching the young favorite into a world where love and power would prove to be the deadliest combination imaginable. What happened next defied every law of imperial protocol and would have been impossible, if not for the terrifying reality that emperors could rewrite the rules of power with a single gesture. Within hours of that silk summons, the young man discovered that catching imperial favor was like stepping into a whirlpool. You either drowned in the depths or rose to the surface as something entirely new. The transformation began immediately and proceeded with breathtaking speed that shocked even the most jaded palace observers. Month 1. He moved from cramped servants' quarters to private apartments within the palace complex itself, chambers that most court officials would never see in their lifetimes. The emperor appointed him Shizhong, imperial attendant, and granted him the ceremonial title Director of Imperial Equine Operations. The position carried no real military authority, but its symbolic weight was staggering. Only trusted intimates managed the ruler's horses. But titles were meaningless compared to what happened behind closed doors. The sovereign began consulting his favorite on administrative matters that shaped the empire's daily operations. The young man demonstrated something that separated him from mere beautiful faces: genuine competence. He could digest complex reports about grain shortages, offer strategic insights about military deployments, and discuss policy implications with an intelligence that matched his physical appeal. Year 2 brought honors that made the court gasp with disbelief. When a distant prince was accused of practicing witchcraft, a capital offense that could destroy entire bloodlines, the emperor credited Xian with uncovering the plot. The reward was immediate elevation to Marquis of Gaoan, a noble title that placed him above men whose families had served emperors for generations. The ruler ordered architects to construct a residence for his beloved just outside the main palace walls. The building that emerged was described by scandalized observers as spacious as an imperial palace itself. Gardens, courtyards, and ceremonial halls that rivaled the emperor's own quarters. When completed, the sovereign filled it with treasures from the imperial treasury, weapons more precious than those carried by generals, jewels that outshone the crown regalia, silk tapestries that had been woven for previous emperors. Perhaps most shocking of all, construction began on the favorite's tomb directly adjacent to the imperial mausoleum. In Chinese culture, where burial proximity reflected eternal relationships, this was tantamount to declaring the young man his spiritual equal. Year 3 brought a decision that would reshape Chinese history forever, one so unprecedented that court historians struggled to find any comparable precedent in 4 centuries of imperial records. The emperor made a choice that defied every law of tradition, every principle of governance, every boundary that had separated the possible from the unthinkable. The announcement sent shockwaves through the palace, creating chaos that rippled from the imperial chambers to the furthest corners of the empire. When news of the decision reached the court, seasoned ministers who had witnessed the rise and fall of 3 emperors found themselves reaching for their emergency escape plans. Some immediately requested urgent reassignments to distant provinces. Others suddenly discovered pressing family obligations that required extended absences from the capital. The decision itself was couched in language that made experienced courtiers break into cold sweats. Official proclamations used phrases that carried historical weight beyond their surface meaning, words that transformed routine imperial business into constitutional crisis. Whispered conversations filled every corridor of the Forbidden City. What the ruler had done was so far beyond traditional precedent that many questioned whether it was legally possible. Others wondered if it represented divine madness or calculated revolution. The most terrified simply wondered how long they had before the inevitable consequences began claiming lives. The transformation of the clerk's family proceeded with equal audacity. His father rose from minor clerk to high ministerial rank. His brother received military appointments traditionally reserved for imperial relatives. His sister became an imperial consort, ranking just below the empress herself. An entire clan was being systematically positioned in ways that suggested the sovereign's ultimate intentions went far beyond mere favoritism. Yet perhaps most tellingly, despite the unprecedented authority granted to him, the favorite never changed his daily routine. He remained constantly at the emperor's side, attending to personal devotion rather than official duties. Court observers understood the implications. His real power came not from any title or position, but from commanding the affections of the one man whose next decision would either fulfill an impossible dream or trigger the bloodiest crisis in Chinese imperial history. But even these extraordinary titles paled compared to the daily reality of the young man's life, because the emperor had granted him something no amount of gold could buy: complete access to the most powerful man on earth. Every morning, he woke not in servants' quarters or even noble residences, but in chambers within the Forbidden City itself. He and his wife had been granted permanent residence in the palace complex, an honor so unprecedented that court historians struggled to find any comparable precedent. in 4 centuries of imperial record-keeping. Their daily routine read like a fantasy of absolute privilege. Joint meals served on imperial porcelain, shared transportation in the sovereign's own carriages during public ceremonies, coordinated schedules that treated the favorite not as a subject, but as an imperial equal. When the ruler attended court sessions, his beloved sat beside him. When the emperor traveled to inspect military installations, his companion accompanied him as his primary advisor. The sovereign had become psychologically dependent on his lover in ways that terrified seasoned court observers. No major decision was made without the young man's consultation. No policy was implemented without his approval. Ministers who had served 3 previous emperors found themselves required to seek his permission before approaching the throne. The material wealth that accompanied this influence defied comprehension. Imperial gifts arrived daily, grants of fertile farmland that generated fortunes, silk monopolies that controlled entire trade routes, reserves of precious metals that could fund armies. Court accountants estimated that the favorite's personal fortune rivaled the imperial treasury itself. Wealth accumulated not through inheritance or military conquest, but through love. His ceremonial treatment shocked traditionalists who believed imperial protocol was sacred and unchangeable. He was permitted to ride in the same carriage as the emperor during state processions, a privilege historically reserved for rulers' mothers and eldest sons. He shared the imperial viewing platform at public festivals, wore robes of imperial yellow, and carried ceremonial weapons reserved for members of the imperial family. Perhaps most tellingly, the sovereign's emotional dependency became obvious to everyone in the palace. When his beloved was absent, even briefly, the ruler became distracted, irritable, unable to focus on state business. Court sessions would be postponed. Military briefings would be delayed. The empire's daily operations began revolving around one young man's presence or absence. The architectural symbols of this devotion were impossible to ignore. The favorite's personal residence was designed to rival the imperial palace in magnificence. Gardens that required hundreds of servants, courtyards paved with precious stones, ceremonial halls where he received visiting dignitaries like a prince. His tomb, under construction beside the emperor's own mausoleum, proclaimed their intended eternal union to anyone who understood Chinese burial customs. Yet underneath this glittering facade lay a terrifying truth that the young man seemed unable to grasp. His unprecedented lifestyle depended entirely on maintaining the affection of one increasingly isolated, emotionally unstable ruler, whose death would transform him instantly from the most privileged man in China into the most hunted. But it was during this pinnacle of power that a single afternoon would create the most enduring symbol of their relationship and reveal just how completely the emperor had abandoned imperial dignity for love. The summer heat in the Forbidden City was suffocating. Even within the palace's marble halls, the air hung thick and oppressive, forcing the court to suspend formal ceremonies during the brutal afternoon hours. The ruler and his beloved had retreated to the emperor's private chambers, seeking refuge on a silk-covered sleeping mat placed near windows that caught whatever breeze might stir. They fell asleep together, as they did most afternoons, a routine that had become so normal that palace staff no longer remarked upon it. But this particular day would etch itself into Chinese cultural memory forever. The sovereign awakened first, his mind immediately shifting to urgent state business that demanded his attention. Military dispatches had arrived from the northern frontier. Provincial governors required immediate responses to their reports. The empire's administrative machinery could not pause, even for imperial rest. But as he prepared to rise, the emperor discovered an obstacle that would have frustrated any other ruler into immediate action. His lover's head was resting peacefully on his silk sleeve, using the precious imperial garment as a pillow. Any other emperor would have simply nudged his companion awake. Imperial duties demanded immediate attention. Military reports required responses. Provincial crises needed resolution. Personal comfort, even of beloved favorites, traditionally yielded to state necessity. Instead, the ruler made a choice that defied every principle of imperial authority and practical governance. He drew his ceremonial dagger, not to wake his lover, but to carefully cut away his own sleeve, leaving the silk beneath the young man's head so he could continue sleeping undisturbed. When the emperor appeared at the subsequent court session, wearing a visibly damaged robe, curious courtiers demanded an explanation. The sovereign's candid account of his sacrifice for love spread through the palace within hours, creating a scandal that somehow transformed into romance. Nobles began cutting their own sleeves as tribute to imperial devotion. What started as one man's tender gesture became a palace-wide fashion statement, then a cultural symbol that would outlive dynasties. Yet this moment of seemingly harmless affection revealed something that chilled experienced observers. The ruler was willing to sacrifice imperial dignity, governmental efficiency, and traditional protocol for one sleeping young man's comfort. If he would cut his sleeve for love, what else might he be willing to cut? The answer would soon test the very foundations of Chinese imperial tradition. But while courtiers cut their sleeves in public tribute, behind palace walls a different kind of cutting was taking place: the systematic elimination of anyone who dared question the emperor's dangerous obsession. The opposition began quietly, as palace resistance always did, with whispered concerns among experienced ministers who had served multiple emperors and understood the deadly mathematics of imperial favor. At its center stood the prime minister, a man whose decades of loyal service had earned him the right to speak uncomfortable truths to imperial power. The prime minister's first warning came in the form of a formal memorial submitted to the throne, a document so carefully worded that it took court scholars hours to decode its true meaning. He reminded the ruler of historical precedents, previous imperial favorites who had risen too high, too fast, and paid ultimate prices for their elevation. He spoke of a former emperor's beloved who had starved to death after his patron's demise, his vast wealth confiscated, and his family exiled to distant provinces. He mentioned another favorite who had been executed by an empress dowager who viewed him as a threat to imperial succession. The message was clear without being treasonous. The young man's meteoric rise was setting him up for an equally spectacular fall. The sovereign's response was swift and merciless. The first victim was a palace secretary who had dared to publicly question the wisdom of granting military authority to someone with no battlefield experience. Within days, he was arrested on fabricated charges of corruption. He died in prison under mysterious circumstances, his death officially attributed to illness, but whispered to involve far more deliberate causes. Next came a provincial governor who had refused to implement tax exemptions that would have enriched the favorite's family. He was recalled to the capital for administrative review and simply vanished. His family received official notification that he had been reassigned to frontier duties, but no one could specify which frontier or when he might return. When the Prime Minister submitted a second memorial opposing the expansion of territorial grants, the emperor's patience finally snapped completely. The charges brought against him were so obviously false that even loyal courtiers were shocked. Embezzlement of funds that were later found intact, correspondence with foreign enemies that no one could produce, disloyalty to the throne that his decades of service directly contradicted. The Prime Minister was given a choice that wasn't really a choice: public execution that would destroy his family's honor for generations, or suicide by fasting that would allow them to maintain some dignity. He chose the slower death, starving himself over several weeks while locked in palace quarters, becoming a living reminder of what happened to those who opposed imperial will. The message resonated through every corner of the Forbidden City. Criticism of the beloved meant death, and the ruler would destroy anyone, regardless of rank, service, or loyalty, who threatened his lover's position. Palace discourse transformed overnight from political debate into fearful silence, leaving the emperor increasingly isolated with only one voice whispering in his ear. With all opposition silenced, the emperor was free to pursue the most dangerous obsession in Chinese imperial history, and what he did next would have been unthinkable if not for the corpses of those who might have stopped him. In 2 BCE, the ruler issued an edict that sent shockwaves through every corner of the empire. Appointing Xian as Minister of War was extraordinary enough, but the language the sovereign used was what made experienced court observers reach for their hidden daggers and emergency escape plans. Heaven gave you to be helper for the Han Dynasty, the edict proclaimed. I know your faithfulness, and I hope that you can guide the great affairs of the empire and follow what is good. These were not merely ceremonial words. They were nearly identical to the legendary phrases used by ancient emperors when transferring power to chosen successors. Language that had never before been applied to anyone without imperial blood. Every scholar in the Forbidden City recognized the reference, and every one of them understood its terrifying implications. The ruler had just announced his lover as heir apparent without officially naming him heir. But the linguistic precedent was only the beginning. What followed was a systematic campaign to position the favorite not just as imperial beloved, but as the future ruler of China. Construction accelerated on the young man's tomb, built directly adjacent to the emperor's own mausoleum, with identical architectural grandeur. In Chinese burial tradition, this placement was reserved exclusively for spouses and designated successors, a physical declaration that he would rule beside the sovereign in death, as he had in life. The material symbols became impossible to ignore. The beloved was granted ceremonial weapons that outshone those carried by generals who had conquered kingdoms. His court regalia exceeded in magnificence the robes worn by previous emperors. Palace protocols were rewritten to treat him with deference, traditionally reserved for crown princes, creating a shadow imperial court that operated parallel to established tradition. Perhaps most shocking of all, the emperor began systematically elevating his lover's family above his own blood relatives. The young man's sister was promoted to the highest consort rank possible without displacing the empress herself, positioning her as potential mother to future imperial children. His father received noble titles, typically granted only to fathers of emperors. His brother was installed in military positions that had historically belonged to imperial family members. The clan was being transformed into an imperial dynasty before the court's horrified eyes. The constitutional crisis this created was unprecedented in Chinese history. For over 4 centuries, the mandate of heaven had passed through imperial bloodlines, each emperor inheriting divine authority through family connection to previous rulers. The entire philosophical foundation of Chinese governance rested on the assumption that heaven selected emperors through hereditary succession. The sovereign was preparing to shatter this sacred principle for love. Foreign kingdoms began sending urgent diplomatic inquiries about succession stability. Provincial governors quietly assessed their loyalties between established imperial tradition and their emperor's revolutionary intentions. Military commanders found themselves caught between sworn oaths to the current ruler and ancient beliefs about legitimate rule. The empire teetered on the edge of constitutional collapse, held together only by the life of one infatuated young emperor whose death would either cement the most radical succession in Chinese history or trigger the bloodiest purge the Han Dynasty had ever witnessed. But as the empire teetered on the brink of this constitutional revolution, fate intervened in the most brutal way possible. The sovereign's own body betrayed him at the moment his dreams seemed within reach. In the sweltering heat of August, 1 BCE, the ruler collapsed during a routine morning court session. Palace physicians rushed to his private chambers as his condition rapidly deteriorated. The chronic illness that had plagued his short reign had finally overwhelmed his 25-year-old body, and everyone present understood that death was approaching with terrifying speed. As the favorite knelt beside the imperial bed, joined by senior court officials and palace physicians, the dying emperor summoned his remaining strength for one final act that would shock everyone who witnessed it. In his last conscious moments, the ruler issued an imperial decree that used all the traditional language of succession, formal recognition of heaven's mandate, acknowledgement of administrative competence, and the solemn transfer of divine authority. He named his beloved as heir to the dragon throne. The words hung in the suffocating air like a death sentence for everyone present. Palace officials exchanged horrified glances. Court physicians continued their futile treatments while pretending they hadn't heard imperial treason spoken aloud. The young man himself remained frozen in disbelief as the emperor's breathing grew shallow and finally stopped. What happened next revealed the true nature of power when imperial authority dies with its source. Everyone present, including the designated heir, acted as if the succession decree had never been spoken. No one knelt before him in recognition of imperial authority. No one summoned the palace guard to swear allegiance to the new emperor. Court officials simply began the traditional protocols for imperial death, treating the succession order as delirious rambling that held no legal weight. The favorite made no attempt to claim the throne or assert authority based on the ruler's final command. Perhaps he understood immediately that imperial favor died with the emperor who granted it. Perhaps he recognized that without institutional support, even direct succession orders were meaningless. Or perhaps he simply realized that attempting to enforce the decree would mean immediate execution for everyone involved. Within hours, the Grand Empress Dowager had seized the imperial seal and summoned her nephew back to the capital with emergency powers. A distant prince was installed as the new emperor, with her nephew as regent. Traditional succession through imperial bloodlines was restored as if the constitutional crisis had never threatened the dynasty. But this peaceful resolution created a new and deadlier problem. While the succession had been resolved through collective silence, the man who had inspired the radical intentions was still alive. He retained his military title, his accumulated wealth, his family's elevated positions, and most dangerously, his intimate knowledge of imperial decision-making. The new regime understood with crystalline clarity what had to be done. A living reminder of constitutional treason could not be permitted to exist. His very survival was an insult to traditional imperial order, a walking symbol that love could override centuries of dynastic law, a breathing example that commoners could nearly claim the dragon throne. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. The answer came with surgical precision, and it took exactly 5 days to erase the former favorite and everything he represented from the face of the earth. Day 1 began with deceptive normalcy. The young man maintained his routine within the palace complex, still technically holding his position as supreme commander, while the new emperor was installed with proper ceremonies. Palace staff continued their usual deference, though observant eyes might have noticed subtle changes. Slower responses to requests, delayed meal service, guards who seemed less attentive to security protocols. Day 2 brought the first official action. The regent summoned him for what was described as a routine administrative meeting to discuss the transition of military authority. The tone was respectful, almost apologetic. The new regime needed time to organize. Surely he understood the complexities of imperial succession. His cooperation during this delicate period would be deeply appreciated. But behind the courteous language lay an unmistakable message. His military command was being transferred to more reliable hands. Day 3 shattered any remaining illusions of safety. Formal charges were filed against the former beloved, with devastating simplicity. Failure to properly attend the previous emperor during his final illness. The accusation was legally unassailable and morally absurd. How could the person closest to the ruler be blamed for not preventing his death? But legal logic was irrelevant when the real crime was existing as a living symbol of constitutional chaos. By day 4, the systematic dismantling had begun in earnest. Every member of his family was stripped of their positions throughout the imperial bureaucracy. His father lost his ministerial rank and faced immediate exile. His brother was removed from military commands. His sister was expelled from the imperial consort quarters. The accumulated wealth of 4 years, estates, silk monopolies, precious metals, ceremonial weapons, was seized by the imperial treasury. Day 5 brought the final ultimatum, delivered by officials whose courtesy could not mask the finality of their message. The former favorite faced a choice that was no choice at all: public execution that would destroy his family's honor for generations, or private suicide that would allow them to maintain some dignity in death. The decision was swift. He and his wife chose white silk cords in their private chambers, ending their lives together as they had lived them, in defiance of a system that had never truly accepted their elevation. Their bodies were buried hastily the same night to prevent any possibility of public martyrdom. Within days, the regent ordered their graves exhumed to confirm death, then had them reburied within prison grounds as a final humiliation. The message resonated through every corner of the empire. Love could elevate you beyond imagination, but when imperial protection vanished, traditional power structures would reclaim control with methodical brutality. In 5 days, the most dangerous romance in Chinese history had been reduced to unmarked graves and a cultural memory that would outlive the dynasty that destroyed it. Yet even as the empire's most powerful men celebrated the elimination of this constitutional threat, they had unknowingly created something far more dangerous than any living person, an immortal legend that would outlast every dynasty that tried to suppress it. The story they meant to bury in unmarked graves became the story that refused to die. Duan Xiu, the passion of the cut sleeve, embedded itself so deeply in Chinese culture that 2,000 years of political upheaval, foreign conquest, and revolutionary change could never erase it. The phrase survived the fall of the Han Dynasty, the chaos of the Three Kingdoms, the rise and collapse of a dozen imperial houses, and the transformation of China from ancient empire to modern nation. While court historians tried to minimize the young man's role in official records, poets preserved the romance in verses that spread far beyond imperial censorship. Folk storytellers carried the tale through markets and villages where common people understood something that emperors had forgotten. Love stories that challenge power become more powerful when power tries to destroy them. By the Tang Dynasty, 8 centuries after the favorite's death, cut sleeve had become the standard literary reference for relationships between men. Classical scholars used it in philosophical discussions. Painters illustrated the famous scene in silk scrolls. Even imperial officials who publicly condemned such connections would reference the phrase in private correspondence, acknowledging its cultural permanence. The ultimate irony was complete. The very system that had murdered the beloved to preserve traditional values ended up immortalizing him as a symbol of love transcending convention. Modern Chinese-speaking communities still understand cut-sleeve references without explanation. LGBTQ+ advocates invoke the story as evidence that same-sex relationships have deep roots in Chinese civilization. Literature courses examine the tale as a masterclass in how political power and personal desire create inevitable tragedy. Perhaps most remarkably, the cultural memory survived not despite the violence used to suppress it, but because of that violence. Every attempt to erase the story only proved its central truth, that some human connections are stronger than the systems designed to control them. The clerk who almost became emperor became something more dangerous, an idea that emperors could never kill.